Frank.
Commissioner?
Sir.
Are we ready? All right, this is Tuesday, August 11th, 2020. I'm calling the City Commission work session to order. Call the roll.
Commissioner Frank O'Donnell,
Here.
Commissioner Rocky Smith,
Here.
Commissioner Denise McGriff,
Present.
Mayor Dan Holliday is absent this evening, and Commission President Rachel Lyle-Smith.
Here. All right, so the first item on the agenda is the future agenda items. Mr. Conkle.
So we've identified for the next month a follow-up on the request to look at a process for dealing with pre-apps, whether that was recording or documentation with better notes. So that was a discussion bringing back for the commission, a mural discussion from the tourism group that relates to the sign code and murals that are currently not allowed in Oregon City. And then a Beaver Creek Road concept plan funding discussion. And then I guess the question would be, is there's anything additional for upcoming work sessions that are not included on the list that we've identified?
I'll open it up. Commissioner O'Donnell?
A couple things. One is just going to be a question, but Jerry Herman has approached me a number of times about wanting to get in front of the commission about those restoration credits. They would not be linked to any one project. And I would like the commission's support in giving him perhaps 15 minutes of time in a future work session. I know Tony and I have had some initial discussions where Tony felt that there would be an initial required outlay of cash by the city, and Jerry insists that's not the case. So he also insists that other local municipalities, Milwaukee, West Linn, Portland, are gleaning millions of dollars from this fund. And I think it would behoove us to just give them, and even if we limited it to 15 minutes, the opportunity to give that presentation to see if it has value and truly is as is represented.
Any discussion?
Second thing.
Oh, go ahead.
I'm sorry.
Yes, on that one.
How about let's have discussion on that item, just to wrap it up. Commissioner McGriff.
Yes, Commissioner O'Donnell, I am wondering if we could take a little bit of time before that is scheduled to get some information from these other jurisdictions, particularly if it's Milwaukee and West Linn, since they are our neighbors, that if they could share, just so we could get some context, because Mr. Herman has also done the same request to me as he has done to you, and I discussed that a few months back with our city manager about whether we wanted to look at that or not, and I would just like a little more, I'd like a little more documentation of actually what this process is, and if our sister cities have done it, that would be very helpful before Jerry comes in. It could be some background information that we could get ahead of time, if that's okay with you.
It's fine with me. Who do you propose we task with that? Should we task Mr. Herman with giving us references to contact ahead of time? And to whom should we assign that to staff, or should we individually do it?
I would prefer if we could without overburdening our staff, ask one of our staff to check in with those folks.
Okay, well, let's start with asking Jerry Herman to give us some references if he has them, and provide them to, have him provide them Mr. Conkle. He can assign them as he sees fit, if that would be okay with Mr. Conkle.
Well, I think Mr. Conkle still needs consensus by the commission. Commissioner Smith, do you have any comments?
No, I'm fine with that.
Yeah, I think we're willing if it's a short 15-minute, hear what you have to say, work on it, but
But I think some reference materials from, because I've been hearing about this, that it works in this place and this, but I want to see see something.
Understood.
I agree.
Yeah, Mr. Conkle, do you have any comments or questions on that?
No, ma'am.
So could we hold off on scheduling it until we can get that information first?
Yeah, we'll reach out. I know Gladstone did some work. I wasn't familiar with West Linn, but I know Gladstone did some work right there around Meldrum Bar with the new boat ramp that they put in.
Okay.
And I will contact Mr. Herman and ask him what other municipalities. For some reason, I thought he mentioned Milwaukee, and I'll get that to you.
Yeah, he did to me, and he mentioned West Lynn as well.
Okay, very good.
Okay,
other thing
Commissioner O'Donnell?
Yeah, there's a second question, and I pose this to our city manager. I don't know if he didn't see it or he has not responded. It would appear that we're at a period of time where we issue the biennial survey, and I think that that survey should be reviewed by our commission before it goes out. And I'd say that because the voting population doesn't discriminate between city staff and their city commission. And if something's going to go out that appears to have my blessing, I'd like to make sure that the questions are something that has merit and are not skewed in any one direction and make sense. But I'd like the entire commission to just view them prior to publishing.
Mr. Conkle, do you know if there's a plan to release that survey anytime soon?
There was a plan to, we can bring it on the, on the 19th. Just to refresh everyone's memory, we did this 2 years ago for the first time, the community-wide survey. Right now, there's 3 questions that are really a lot of flexibility. The vast majority of those questions are pretty standardized so that we can be compared to other jurisdictions throughout the country. But we'll put it on for the 19th in talking with Kristen. And then the 3 questions that we've recommended, and then the commission can decide what they'd like to do with those.
That sounds fine to me.
Yeah,
Sorry.
I appreciate that because the voting population thinks that everything is originated by their city commission when oftentimes it's originated by staff, and we seem to be the recipient of the first response. So thank you for allowing us the chance to see that. That's all I had, Commission President.
Thank you. Are there any other commissioners who would like to comment on this? I have one item, but I'll let others go first. Commissioner Smith says no?
No, nothing.
Commissioner
I
McGrath?
don't at this time,
No.
thank you.
So my question would be to maybe Chief Band, I see him on the line, and Mr. Conkle. So there's a lot of conversations going on right now about policing and police policies, and I know Chief Band gave an excellent presentation to Unite Oregon. Commissioner McGriff and I were both participated and listened in to that presentation. I thought Chief did a wonderful job. I guess I'm wondering from the commission, is there any desire to kind of have an overview or an update from Chief Band regarding policies, questions, presentations, kind of general outreach that's happening to him, and then his response on addressing our community matters regarding policing? Is it too early? Just looking for some feedback. I see Commissioner Smith raising his hand, his physical hand.
Well, I was raising both hands.
It's fine.
I've had a couple emails, as I think some of the other commissioners have had, and some public questions directly to me. And in my mind, I had a conversation with a former Oregon City police officer, because in my mind, we used to have a citizen oversight committee that was separate from the Chiefs Advisory Committee. And I don't know the history of that and how we, what transcended from one committee to another. So, and I don't know necessarily the overlap, but by my memory, we used to have a citizen oversight committee that was kind of a committee to go to in terms of if there was any, debates or issues within the police department. And I don't know if that's something we have in that format anymore, or is how we deal with some of those issues that are, I just don't know where we're at in terms of where we used to be. So I would like an update on that and kind of see if that's something we need to have, or if it's something that we already have some system in order to deal with some of those situations if they come up.
Commissioner Smith,
Yes.
We have a Chiefs Advisory Committee, and I have served on it in the
I said
past.
that, but I don't know that that's the same thing.
No, I'm not aware that we have had a committee of what you're talking about.
So Chief Band is with us, and he can answer that question, I'm sure, better than any of us. But before you do, Chief, I think this is a perfect nexus. This is the exact question that's similar, that I think maybe there's a common thread of questions that are coming in, and it would allow an opportunity for the chief to address some of these and maybe some policy questions that the city commission can consider. Should we have a citizen advisory committee? You know, what is the policy on use of force, for example? I know use of force has come up, you know, so there's just a variety, you know, what is the existing policy, because I know it exists, about chokeholds, and I know the state just passed yesterday, you know, new legislation on that. So there's just a variety of things that, but at the same time, I want to be sensitive to where our community and nationally this conversation is at. So if it's one thing for us to have this conversation because we support our police department, we love our police department, and overall we think they do a great job. But I also don't want to incite anything and bring unwelcome attention if now it's just the right time. So I'm just looking for other feedback, because I certainly have some questions, and if we want to entertain this topic, you know, we could all email our questions to Chief Ban as a potential presentation. So I'll just turn it over to Chief Brand if you have some comments.
Yeah, good evening, Commission. So we, a couple things. We have a Chiefs Advisory Board, which we've had since I've been there since, I think, 99. There's no, oversight is a kind of an interesting word. We do not have an oversight committee of any kind. To my knowledge, we never have. And I think sometimes people associate our advisory with that. What that has always been is it's really kind of open to anybody who wants to come. We have members of every neighborhood are generally there, somebody from the schools, the school board, several people from the school, the municipal court's always been there, the DA's office, the business community. We recently, that conversation I had with Oregon City Unite, they're going to have somebody permanently attached to that. And sort of the function of that is those people see their liaison officer that shows up to their meetings, but they talk more about, I guess, sort of the things that are happening on the street, traffic and those sorts of things. This is them coming in, and we kind of strategize and talk about things at a bigger level about what our hiring is looking like and what our traffic team might be looking like, but kind of a higher view of what's going on in the police department on more of a macro scale. That's what that's always been. I think conversations, this conversation we had with Oregon City Unite was excellent. I think what sort of worked about it was, one, we let the smoke clear the last couple of weeks and everybody sort of take half a breath, I think was probably good. And then I had also asked them for some specific questions as opposed to sort of just an open forum. I'm absolutely willing to do open forums, but that could take a long time. They had given me 8 questions. We actually missed one of them. I just forgot to answer it we spent 2 hours going over 7 questions, and it was a really robust, I thought, a great conversation. And I think the community, certainly there's more of that to be done. So the other thing I guess I would, I welcome any of it. I think it's a great idea. I do think that in terms of time goes fast, and if we burn through 2 hours and 7 questions, I guess my ask would be that whatever you prioritize, you know, we can take it in bites of give a couple questions and we'll come work through it. Just trying to be mindful of your time.
Yeah, so go ahead, Commissioner Smith.
I'm sorry. I could be completely wrong, but my memory is it could go back 15, 20 years with the police department. And so it predated the Chiefs Advisory Committee, and my memory was there was some type of citizen grievance committee that dealt with issues that were, grievances and complaints and those kind of things. Now, I don't know why my memory is saying that, but that goes back to when my father worked at the police station way back when, so I could be completely wrong, but I would like to at least, know if that's true, if we had something or what that was, but.
Well, I'm 21 years there, and
yeah, so it could be it might be before that.
it has not been there. I think the sort of so a couple things. One, we have a very robust complaint policy, and it's got a bunch of shalls in it. If somebody comes in and has a complaint with the police department, it isn't whether or not we choose to investigate it. We do investigate it.
Right.
It's a formal process. The sort of, if you look at communities, oversight generally is, you would have to sort of define, and I would have to look into a little bit about what is oversight. In some cities, they literally weigh in on what use of force of policy is about complaints. Portland they have a protocol that they've come up with if there's officer-involved shootings and things like that they have a set of criteria that, you've got the police department with its priorities, case law, and then you have an oversight committee that also has, it can be very robust. That's a whole conversation in and of itself that I probably wouldn't want to just break into without, that would be its own topic.
Well, I guess most of it is just really an education to us about because I need an update clearly about what the process is for those kind of situations. I think the public, wants to know that too. So I think, when we get emails in general about process, I want to be able to answer those and know kind of how that works. So that might be as simply just explaining to us, our current process and how we deal with situations.
Commissioner Lyle-Smith?
Yes, Commissioner McGriff.
Chief Band, would doing some sort of presentation, a short presentation, kind of recapping what you did at the session, and just for the record correction, it's Unite Oregon City. That's the name of the group. So we want to get in the record correctly. Anyway, something like that. You had, you gave, I thought, a very comprehensive explanation about how the police department does things and what they do. And I think that would not only be beneficial to the other commissioners who were not on the call, but I think it would be beneficial to our public in general.
Well, I think the question for this group is that an appropriate thing for a work session or a commission meeting, or are we leaning, or should we consider a community engagement of our community is asking a lot of questions, and therefore we want to have a town hall where folks, and we have to figure out the format. There's a lot that would need to go into that planning, but the avenue for the delivery of this information, it depends, obviously on the scope of what we're talking about. That's an option. And I don't know, Mr. Conkle and Chief Band, if you guys have thought about that or considered that. I know I have heard the comment that the police department's been kind of quiet, whereas we want to hear from the police department. And so, and the police department, I think, is well loved in this community. So I would like to think that it would be a positive event, is like the Unite Oregon City presentation that you gave the other night, maybe not for 2 hours for 7 questions, but.
Summary. What about the idea of doing a presentation at a work session and then follow that up, process it so that then we could have a town hall, but I mean, allow for some lead time to get it set up. We could use what the chief did as sort of an introduction, and then say there, we will follow it up with something very succinct. So definitely not 7 questions, but maybe a topic of one of those 7 questions, and that would be the subject of a community meeting of some sort.
Well, I think,
You know,
oh, let me just say one
Well, I
quick
was
thing. I think we have two different conversations, right? We have one that's educational for us, but maybe for the public. But our job here is policy. And, what are the policy questions? What are the police department policies? Are there any changes? Do we want to have a citizen advisory oversight committee or whatever that is? You know what I mean? Like, so I think we should separate the two between an educational conversation versus if we have policy questions and we need input on what our policies are, if we should consider new policies. And I guess I just see the two. I feel like it could be, we could be here half the night if we're talking about all of it all at one time. And so that may be one way to kind of break it up. Chief Van?
I see the same, I completely agree with you. And I think that maybe a thing, because people are busy as well. And this could be something, whether we did it on a monthly basis or we did it biweekly or something like that. But I don't see any reason why we couldn't. I did not know what to think, to be honest, how that thing was going to go the other night. Because, it's such a hot topic, and, we just really want the community there with us. And I think I didn't realize the appetite people have right now for, that kind of really what we really do, I think, on a daily basis. I think it's a real positive. So maybe if there's some specific things that you as a commission think along the lines of what you're saying, Commissioner Lyle-Smith, and then maybe we can just sort of, we've already talked about this a little bit, about whether or not we did something on an ongoing sort of, do some open forums every, the third Thursday of every month or something. And this week we're going to cover these two questions. And that way people could plug into the ones that they're there for, and maybe, then it's only a half an hour, 45 minutes, or an hour at the most. So it's digestible, and it's something that we're doing on sort of an ongoing basis. And just kind of have this conversation go on with the community for a little while. I mean, that would be very doable. And I, if the community didn't like it, they weren't showing up, we could just stop doing it.
So I guess to rein in this conversation, so we don't take the rest of the night, I do want to move on the agenda.
Can we hear from Mr. Conkle?
Do you have any comments?
I think whatever if that's something that the commission's interested in, we could certainly start to look at how to do that. There's a big community event versus a reoccurring event versus the policy discussion. And I guess if where would, what's the interest of the commission moving forward?
Right, so that's where
each of those are pretty different and distinct exercises.
So that's where I was going to go. So for the item that I mentioned of bringing this whole thing up, I would like to request that Chief Ban and City Manager Conkle, and maybe our, PIO working on communications, you guys talk about what is our outreach engagement around policing in the city, and, the forums, is it, what is that structure? What are some options? You guys think about that. That would be my suggestion. And then from the commission side, it's on a policy level, what questions do we have? And we gather our thoughts and gather our questions, and maybe then that piece becomes our own work session item. That would be, I guess, my proposal.
Commissioner Lyle-Smith, I'm not going to be contrary, but I think part of our role is to also help provide information and education to our community, because there's things that we know that we get into great detail that may not be totally of interest to everyone, but the topic is interesting. So I think it's really two things. I don't want to fix something that's not broken.
Right.
And from the communications that I have had with our community members about policing, nobody has brought up the ideas that they're doing something wrong and we need an oversight committee. And what I think people are trying to do, for what I understand, is that they're just trying to understand what it is that we do as a community and as a city police department. And I think we have an obligation to help them understand what that is. Because you can say, oh, I love police all I want, but we still have people standing out there who think that somebody in this community wants to defund the police department, and that is definitely not the case.
Right.
So anyway, I appreciate your
Commissioner O'Donnell,
diligence with this.
you have your question, your hand?
Yeah, I've sort of been sitting here listening to the conversation and watch it wander around the block a little bit.
Yeah.
And I really think, you have to define to your staff members and to your chief, what is it exactly we want? And I don't want any inference that some component is missing. But if that is the inference, then the question is define for the chief what component is missing. And, the educational component of when we start talking in terms of oversight, that's a very different discussion than in terms of education as to how our local department works. So I think we almost need, I don't feel the question's thoroughly defined, and maybe that's an offline conversation to banter around until we arrive at some consensus that what is it we're really asking for. So quite honestly, I'm a little bit confused as to the request myself, even with my background. So I'll leave it at that, but I think we need to choose and define our terminology closely so we don't wander off, we don't miss the mark of what it is that my other members of the commission are asking for. Thanks.
I guess I've heard, it sounds like there are questions coming to commissioners about certain aspects of policing. Mm-hmm. Is that a manageable amount of information that we could start with and bring back and then build from there? Like use of force, statistics that we've had over the last year. I mean, is that useful to the commission? Is that something you're interested in, or is it we need more time to think about this?
No, I think it would be very useful. I think the public would be interested in knowing some of that information so that they can be informed when they're talking to other people about it. There was just a little article in the Oregonian about the number of arrests they've done with people of color in Portland. Well, obviously, we're not really operating in that arena, but I could see a community member saying, well, that really doesn't happen here, or this is what we do here, so that you have people talking to each other and they have the right information. They're not just figuring out something off the top of their head or saying, oh, I don't know what we do. I think it's both. What she said, there's policy, if there is any policy, but it's also about getting information out so people can have informed conversation.
Commissioner O'Donnell?
Well, once again, I'd just say, what is the question that the population wants answered? I mean, we could wander around and answer questions that aren't even posed, and I think that the Citizen Involvement Committee is a venue for getting those to our department's attention. I'm all for communication, even if it's published through our communications officer. What is it we're soliciting? General operational policies, statistics. What is of interest to our people? That's what you want to answer. I'm a little bit. I just don't want to wander around the block. I want to perform a specific answer to a specific question. Thanks.
Right, so I brought up this topic, so I'm going to try to put it back into its bucket so we can move on. I brought it up because I think there's a community conversation that needs to happen. And my question was, it started out as, does that conversation need to happen in a work session? Is that the proper venue for that conversation where there's a common set of questions that we're getting, or we could come up with a top 10 list of questions that we're getting and easily try to address those, whether that's we're putting out a FAQ, whether or not we're putting something on the website, or maybe we do that and we have a community forum. So my question was whether or not, and then of course there are policy questions, and I just wanted to, I do agree that I think there's an education component, and that's majority of the questions that we get is kind of what's happening, what is our department's policy on use of force? What is our department's policy on chokeholds? What are the, so we could come up with, because it's hard to know what the police policies are in general. So we could head that off and have some straightforward FAQs, questions that we're all getting emails on, questions that Chief Ban has had repeatedly. So I just think that there's an outreach component, and I'm questioning whether or not this venue as a work session agenda item is the right venue, or if we ask staff to consider another outreach venue. And so at this moment, you're right, Commissioner O'Donnell, we are all over the place. We're wandering all over the place. So I don't think we're giving clear direction. So I guess I would just ask Chief Ban and Mr. Conkle to think about it, think about what would be helpful for our community, and just consider it as far as educational and community outreach piece. That was my goal of bringing it up, that I feel like there is a desire for more information, and I don't know that the work session is the right venue. I do agree we have a role at educating folks, but I want to make sure, I'm just not sure that the work session is the right venue, and if it's not, so I wanted to hear from the commissioners as if you thought it was the right venue, and if it's not, have the staff consider other options. Did that put a bow on it?
I think we can get to work. I've already got some ideas. I'm sure Tony does, and let us just get to work, and we'll get back to you, and then and I mean quick, we'll get on this. I've got some ideas, and then we'll reassess.
Yeah.
So I think what I'm hearing is that if there's consensus, that Chief and I will look at educational community outreach options, whether that's an open house, a series every Thursday night, FAQs, whatever that may be.
Yeah.
The discussion about the policy in a work session, we're going to hold for now until, or not, unless there are certain things that the commissioners want to forward us that we bring back in a work session that's specific to use of force policy.
Right.
So I think I've got clear direction on the one, as it relates to the outreach and education of trying to identify a plan to do that. I guess the second question is there interest, does the commission want a work session on certain questions?
I don't know that anybody has any questions, so I guess I would say if you have any policy questions like the one that Commissioner Smith brought up earlier about what was the history of the Citizen Oversight Committee, did we have one, around, because that is a topic of a policy question, I think. If you have any questions, maybe we'll send them to you, and if it turns out there's only one question or two questions and you can follow up individually, then maybe that solves this and takes care of it, and it's done.
I'm satisfied with the direction that you said, because that's kind of where I was going, so I'm fine.
Any last comments by?
Commissioner Smith and O'Donnell, does that seem reasonable?
That's fine. Like I say, define the questions before you try to answer a question that you don't even have. So I'm fine with the directions being set.
Okay, so I think we've beat this topic to death. Okay. Thank you, Chief Ban. So I'll move on to discussion items on the agenda. We have two. I'd like to add a third one at the request of Ms. Turway. So this is just to let folks know she has an item to bring forward to us, and it is about a letter of support for a grant. And I was going to make that number 3 on the discussion items. Is that okay with everybody?
Already a number 3.
Or a number 4, sorry. I'm going to make it number 4. All right, seeing no objection or hearing no objection, let's move on to number 2, the additional permitting and notification draft policy for city tree removal.
Thank you very much.
Ms. Turway, I was like, who's taking this item? Yeah.
Laura Turway, Community Development Director for the City of Oregon City. So we are coming back to you for another work session regarding additional permitting and notice for removal of city trees. The purpose of this presentation, mind moving that to the top left corner? Sorry, I should do these slides differently to account for that. The purpose of the policy was to provide direction so that the city was more thoughtful when they considered removal of significant trees. That direction was provided by the city manager back in October, and it included some specific tasks such as an internal review process for removal of significant trees that are on city property, and the removal is happening from the city itself, and also making sure that process considers alternatives to tree removal, and then also a mechanism for some type of public notification. Change the slide for me, please. I just wanted to review some of our statistics from 2019 before we moved further, so we had an idea of how much tree removal is actually happening. So we, as you know, we're a Tree City USA, so we have to keep track of how much money we identify towards trees and how many trees we prune, plant, and remove. So in 2019, we spent about $500,000 total on trees in the city, and so that's out of all the city departments, but mainly parks and public works. They planted 628 trees. That did include the money from our tree mitigation fund. 666 trees were pruned and 188 trees are removed. Some of those trees, next slide please, are significant trees that we're about to talk about, and some are not. Most of them are not. A little bit more background. So we had the direction for the city manager to work on this policy. We had a city commission direction that broadened the scope a little bit to include regulation of trees on all institutional property. We worked with the Natural Resources Committee to create a set of standards and some draft plan, and we worked with the Planning Commission on that. And then back on July 7th, we came back to the city commission, and some of that direction regarded moving forward, going with just a policy on how we regulate the trees ourselves. We have Natural Resources Committee. We're going to bring this back to them tomorrow, and then PRAC later this month. So what we're looking for tonight, next slide, is your feedback on how this new version is going. So with this draft policy, I'm just going to go through it real quick. Again, it only applies to city removal of city trees. That includes both trees on city property and urban renewal property, and city removal of trees within the right-of-way. This won't apply if the public wants to remove a tree in the right-of-way. Next slide. As you recall, the direction from the city manager was to use our heritage tree program as a basis for identifying these special type trees that should be considered in a more rigorous process. The Natural Resources Committee suggested adding a Pacific madrone to the list. So in this specific policy, it's the heritage tree list plus the addition of one additional species. Next slide. There is some exemptions in this program. So if the city is removing the tree on city property, it's subject to everything I'm about to tell you, except if it's in a habitat restoration area. So if there is a place where we have an approved restoration plan, sometimes those restoration plans include leaving woody debris on site or some type of management. And so those are exempt from this policy. In or abutting water quality facilities, that was added based off last City Commission's work session. If there's a tree that is lifting a sidewalk that's not compliant with the Americans with Disabilities Act, ADA, and this is talking about, again, city tree removal, then it's exempt from this policy. There was concern expressed about that at the last City Commission work session. Also exempt are nuisance plant lists and then other invasive species around the region. And eminent hazard trees, there's a little star next to eminent hazard trees because that would be a tree that is been hit by a car and is in the middle of the road, is about to fall over within the next 72 hours, some type of problem. So in those situations, they can remove the trees, document it, but then they'll have to go back and go through the process. But in those cases, you wouldn't need an arborist report. So the process is slightly different. Next slide. In this scenario, if a department wanted to remove a tree, and mainly we're talking about public works and parks, they would have to assemble some documentation as to where the tree is, how big it is, what species, why they're removing it, and then list
some other things they can do other than remove the trees. So what type of alternatives are being considered? If it is it in the way of a sidewalk and we can meander the sidewalk, or there's some type of other reasons? Is there a building we can just want to put in a different location? Next slide. So then we'll take that body of documentation and it goes to that department manager. That department manager reviews it, makes sure it's okay, and then it goes to a third party for review. So the third party for review includes a choice of two different mechanisms. One is an certified arborist. And so an arborist would write their own report with analyzing the data, the report from the staff, and taking a look at the tree, looking at alternatives as they see them, identifying what the cost and practicality of those alternatives are, and then they come out with their written report. If a tree is over 50 inches DBH, or diameter or breast height, then it automatically needs to go through an arborist report. If it's less than 50 inches, then the manager can choose to send it through a staff assessment. That staff assessment would include staff from Public Works, Parks, and the Planning Department. And those staff would work together to look at the report that came out of the original department, look at those alternatives, look at what the cost and practicality of those alternatives are, and write another report. So I think that by now we have two reports. We have the initial report from the department that wants to remove the tree, and then we have a secondary report from some third-party reviewer. Next slide. So then an application is submitted for tree removal. There's other permits that are needed inevitably for tree removal, but in this policy, this tree removal would have a 14-day notice period. So we would create a website similar to where you would find land use notices already on the website. Then we put these two reports there. Anyone in the public could sign up to get an email every time that we post these trees on the website. So they could stay up to date with what trees are being removed in the city. And then also there would be a physical notice that would be tied around the tree. So if you're a neighbor and you're not on the website, you can still see a notice that the tree is proposed to be removed. The point of this is to let people know it's being removed and give them a chance to see these analyses that happened, to make sure that they're aware of what's going to happen and the thought process as to why. If after those 14 days there's still concerns from neighbors or outstanding questions, then it gets elevated to the city manager, and the city manager can decide we're not going to do this tree removal, or we can move forward with the tree removal at that point. If there are no unresolved questions or anything like that, then the city can move forward with the tree removal, and we would issue the tree removal permit. Next slide. There was really, really large trees. There was a notion that they should be treated slightly different though. So for trees that are bigger than 50 inches diameter at breast height, those would be placed on the city commission consent agenda, and you can pull it from the consent agenda and talk more about why it's being removed and choose to, again, not remove that tree if that's the direction from the commission. Notice of that would also go to the Natural Resources Committee, Parks and Rec Advisory Committee, and then the Transportation Advisory Committee, just because some might be in the right-of-way and some might be in parks. Next slide. So there's some additional requirements that came from the commission. So one is that these large trees, the ones going to the city commission for review, they shouldn't be able to be removed and then just pay a fee, which we call fee in lieu. So when you remove a tree, you have to mitigate for that tree removal generally by planting more trees or paying money so that the city can plant more trees. And so in this case, we want to actually see the trees in the ground rather than wait until they could be planted later by the city. So for large trees, no fee in lieu allowed. And then there was also a direction from the commission to reuse the wood if it's feasible. And so in this, we put that the caliper would be 25 inches or more if you have a certain size tree, it's not diseased, if it's feasible to reuse the wood, then the city ought to be able to do that.
there was discussion at the last city commission meeting about what that means, and it ranges from doing something with the wood, curing the wood, having it planed, to, at the very least, putting it in a pile for the public to use as firewood. There are costs associated with this whole policy in general. There's obviously some staff time involved, but the arborist report, particularly this reuse of wood, the consideration of alternatives. And so there needs to be an annual budget that's established for this program if it's really going to work. Because a lot of it is, you know, perhaps some people may have considered alternatives, but if there's no funding to pay for whatever needs to be done for the tree, plus ongoing assessment to maintain and watch trees when there's Dutch elm disease, so they're not removed, or things like that, then it's really not going to work very well. It needs to be a little bit more holistic and have some budgetary component to it. Next slide. That's all I have, and I'm looking for direction from the commission if I'm pointed in the right way with this policy, if there's any things you want to change, and then eventually next steps. Do you want another work session, or should I go back to natural resource and prac with this kind of firmed up, and then when I'm done with them, come back to you for adoption by resolution?
Okay, Commissioner O'Donnell, your hand is raised.
Sure, why not? Well, we obviously know what not to do based on the public pool black walnut debacle. So I looked at this policy. It looks pretty good. There's things I like about it a lot. I like the 14-day posted public notice. All you do is look back at that fiasco we had and say, what happened and how can we avoid that? And then reach even further, which we did, into the public works component. And I think it's a very good start. And I'm good with it as written. I read it in its entirety. I would be curious what staff thinks the estimated annual budget is going to be to support this. And I know that would just be a wild guess because we have no idea how many events we'll have. And then what did they propose as a source of financing? Is it fees or out of the city general fund, or what would that be? So those are my comments, but by and large, I like the looks of it, and it undoes all the errors that we made initially. So thanks for a nice piece of work from what I see.
Ms. Turway, do you want to answer?
Yes, good question on funding. I'm sure we'll take as much funding as we can get, because the more funding we have, the more we can do, right? So we have had some initial conversations with the finance director, so there is places to get at least some moderate funding amounts. The thing that is interesting is how sometimes saving some trees costs so much more money than a lot of little projects that you can do. So for example, one of the trees at the library, that was part of it was planed and saved and used for shelves, was $75,000. It's not reasonable to spend that on every tree removal. So there's a little bit of common sense that's going to have to be used. We'll try and find as much money as we can that makes sense, that's to be dedicated towards this. We'll have to talk about it in the next upcoming biennium budget, because it would be a new thing.
Commissioner O'Donnell, did you have additional comments? You're muted.
Well, citing the library is a very unique and specific example that had to do with our desire to integrate those tree proceeds into our library. So, let's not use that as an example. I think let's go back to the source of funding. Should we dedicate some portion of the fees or removal to, because I think it makes sense to put that toward future salvation of other trees and this program. So I think there's a discussion to be had. I'll leave it at that.
I'm not sure which fees you're referring to, because this is city-owned property.
Charge.
So we don't have any fees for removal of street trees. We do have a fee for this fee in lieu. So if anyone in the development community, including the city, wants to remove a tree and there's not physically enough space to replant the mitigation that's required, they can pay us a fee, and we use that money to fund Friends of Trees every year. And we do have some specific limitations on some of that money, but we can take a look at it. If we're looking at smaller amounts, like $30,000, that is okay. $30,000 from each department, one for Public Works and Parks. They're kind of two separate little budget items. So we're feeling that there is hope to move in a direction, at least get some money in there to do something. And my apologies for the example of the library. That's just the only one that seems to be known. There's a lot of the Dutch elm diseases on the other trees in front of the library. We've been monitoring those for decades, and so having arborists come out, some of that's already part of the budget, so.
Yeah, I guess my question is, you know, normally, if we have trees on city property, the city is having to take care of those trees. Are you saying we would just cut them down and remove them, and therefore that's the cheapest way out, and therefore this is not a budget issue typically, but this policy is going to cause a...
The policy is going to cause additional work to go into justification of a decision that's being made. Typically, it's been, go down in certain parts in certain parks. Folks in the Parks Department know that some of these trees are pretty bad. They're got hollowed out limbs, or they're dropping limbs throughout the year, but it's not documented, right, through an arborist report, because we don't have an arborist. So then there's the cost of documenting that through an arborist report, which is an added cost.
But the policy, though, as written, though, you said has two avenues. One is, sound like the division manager could choose whether or not you needed an arborist report, or if you could have a third-party staff report. Granted, there's still costs for
it's going to depend. Yeah, I mean, there's probably some where it's very obvious, right? And there's going to be others that are kind of on the fence. You look at it and, they've been fracking it for years, and it's been not leafing out, and it's been reducing every year. It's been an accumulative slow die, essentially.
Commissioner O'Donnell, you have follow-up questions?
No, not a question, just a statement. It was a fairly unique example, but our pool tree was a black walnut tree. It had actually market value. It could have been sold, and those funds could have been dedicated to the fund. So, looking at whatever species of tree we have, if it in fact has market value, we need to consider that as a possible source of funding. Thank you.
Okay, so seeing no other comments, I'll go. I like the policy. I think it's much improved versus the previous version that came before us. I'm not sure that I'm in agreement with the exempting the trip hazard, the number 3, and that with lifting of greater than 0.25 inches, because that was essentially the issue at the pool, where we had a trip hazard, didn't meet ADA standard. I would have liked for that tree to have gone through this process of review. So I'm curious as to why that's listed there as an exemption. Is there something I'm missing? Is there another process?
No, you bring up a good point, and it's about balance. So we know that we have to comply with the ADA, and we also have these tree policies. We have had a lot of conversations with at least John Lewis, our Public Works Director, about how much we are supportive of people just grinding down sidewalks in order to save the trees. There is a point where that might not make sense, but maybe there's a lot more points where that would make sense doing that more in the future. It is listed exemption. If you don't want it as exemption, we can take it off. We're just wanting to make sure that we didn't have a trip hazard sitting out there for another month or two while we go through this process, but we always have a lot of trip hazards out there, so.
Does the exemption apply to, that doesn't apply to those trees on the list, right? The exemption only applies to trees that aren't on the list, is that correct?
The whole process only applies if the species is on the list. So of the trees that we remove in the year as a city, this is only if it is those ones that would a heritage tree or the additional species listed. So most trees it wouldn't apply to. I mean, the most common ones that we remove seem to be smaller or invasive or something like that.
All right, so that's my only item, I guess, of concern for me. I think it should not be listed as an exemption.
I don't know if Commissioner Smith wants to go next, because I have a list.
Commissioner Smith, you're muted.
I know. Sorry. I will agree with what was just stated by Commissioner Wilesmith, but I think everything's pretty much acceptable. I guess I would have the same question about the exemption on that one piece, but that's it.
Commissioner McGriff?
Yes, I'll start with the easy one. I agree. I do not think that the item that you mentioned, the exemption for ADA, I took it upon myself to review the Americans with Disabilities Act, and there is nothing in there that says you can't come up with an alternative process in order to remove the exemption. Maybe it's not grinding. I used an example before of what the Rose Farm Management Committee did for a very large oak tree that's on Rylance Lane. We went around the tree in order to save it. It is now ADA compliant. I think if there's some grinding that could be done to save a tree, and I want to specifically talk about the ones that were on 3rd Street that were very large trees that were the only shade trees on 3rd Street in the McLaughlin neighborhood, and they were removed. I went to look at the lift. It could have easily been repaired in another way in order to preserve those trees.
Was that a private or a public?
It was in the public right-of-way.
But was it a property owner that did
A
that?
property owner came in. So
Okay,
I'm getting there.
Okay.
I'm using that as an example of where we could have said, yes, we know that it doesn't comply right now, but what are the alternatives that could be employed that could save that particular tree? And I'm thinking about the broader impacts of trees, which, you know, there's a lot of asphalt on 3rd Street. It cools that down. There's no place for people to park their cars under the shade of the tree, including the property owner. So I really don't want that in there. The other thing that I have a concern about is the fact that if it's in the public right-of-way, it really doesn't matter who's trying to take it out. That belongs to the public right-of-way. If it's a private property owner who is trying to take a tree out in the public right-of-way, that is still the public. This still applies. And I don't understand why we would exempt the public from that particular thing if it's in the right-of-way. I mean, my goal in the future is to get to some sort of an ordinance where we are doing regulation of trees, and I'll just admit it. But we have to start with walking our own talk. So if it applies to us and we're setting a higher standard, that tree is within the public right-of-way, and it should apply to a private party who wants to take out a tree that's within the street right-of-way. To me, it's not any different. We're not saying that, okay, now this is not part of the public right-of-way, but today it is. The other comment that I have involves...
Where is that in the policy? I know it's in here.
It's on the first page under step 1, under additional permitting for tree notification. It says, this process does not apply to the public removal of city trees. And I really think it needs to, because if it's a city tree in the city right, and not that we own it, but it's in the public right-of-way, to me, that's a city tree. I have a question about, on page 8 of the packet, we have under option 2 for the staff assessment memorandum. I have every confidence in our staff, but this is a little loosey-goosey, and if we have people on staff who do not have experience with trees, I'm not real comfortable with that, and I'm not sure how we're making that determination if a person, I mean, the only person I know that's really got a lot of experience with trees happens to be Pete. Now, I don't know if he's going to be able to expand his knowledge base to the other staff people, and what are we doing to get people more, what do I want, background or information, qualifications to deal with trees specifically. I think it's a real opportunity to get some additional continuing education credits, if that's possible, so that we have a knowledge base. So, you know, if for some reason Pete leaves, we're not devoid of that, you know, all that information doesn't go out the door. So I think that that's something we should maybe look a little further at. I have no problem with the option. I'm just concerned about, I put qualifications. You have a staff with experience or educational background in forestry management is preferred. So do we have any of those people on staff? Are we doing anything to help people get a little more, knowledge? I know Friends of Trees puts on some educational programs that might be helpful, something that would be, cost effective. I guess I have a concern, again, about the trees being only limited to this list. So that walnut tree is not on this list? Would that have been, we would have not done anything with it because it's a walnut tree and it's not on this list?
I think it would have based on the caliper. So there's specific species.
Right, so we've got species and then we've got caliper.
Yeah, and then all deciduous 20 inches or more, or evergreen trees 18 inches or more.
Because I can't recall at this moment what the species of the trees were on Third Street that were removed. But they were quite large and they would have fallen under this. I think that we need, there's a lot of interesting trees in our community, some of which, obviously aren't native, but I mean, I'm aware that there's a catalpa tree on 5th Street. I'm not sure how it is actually growing here because it's generally only grown in the southern United States. There is one on the Holmes property, but it is probably within the next year it is going to be removed, but it's specifically on, because it's dying. I have been the advocate for it for the last 10 years, and every year there's less and less leaves on it, and there's more dead branches on it, and it's hollow in the center. So unfortunately, I've had to concede that, yes, maybe we have to take that out. The other thing is about the wood. I like Commissioner O'Donnell's suggestion that if it does have some market value, that it could be sold. But I was also contacted by a group. I can't get the specific name, but James Hall is a member of it, and it's a specific woodworkers group that exists here in Clackamas County, and they're always looking for wood to do projects with, and I know that, I think not only that, I think that gavel came out of something that was done with some wood that we gave to someone.
That's library.
Yeah, and then the library stuff, and then we also have a conference table that was done out of that. So, I mean, if there's a way that we could also use this group as an avenue for reuse of the wood, I mean, they could find something that we might need, make it and give it to us, and then they could get the rest of the wood. But I think there's other opportunities besides a sale, although I like your idea. I thought that was a great idea. I would hate to find out that walnut tree just became firewood, because that was some nice wood. I mean, I saw some of the pieces after it was taken down in tight rings, and that would have made a nice something. I don't know what, but anyway, those are I think you all are well aware that I'm a little disappointed that we have narrowed the focus, because I think what's good for us is good for Clackamas County, Wes, anybody else that's a public agency, but I'll postpone that plea for another day. But I do want to recommend that that this process does need to apply to the entire public right-of-way, no matter who's taking it out, and that we need to look for alternatives, if possible, for ADA requirements, because there's more than one way to make sure something is ADA compliant.
Is that it? Are you done?
For now.
Okay.
Thank you.
So I think you though need to probably get consensus from the commission on some of these items, correct?
Yes, can I repeat back a couple things?
Yes.
All right, so I thought I saw a majority of you supporting the removal of the ADA exemption. In other words, trees that are lifting a sidewalk should also be subject to this policy. I'm seeing some head nods on that one. Okay, so we'll go ahead and do that. Then the next question is, should the public who wants to remove a street tree be subject to the standards, or are these standards only for if the city wants to remove a city tree?
Commissioner Smith?
I have a question actually about that. So my question, I guess, goes back to some of the history to when the school district removed all the trees in the right-of-way at Barkley, we made them replant them, correct?
Yes.
So why wouldn't we do that with everybody?
They'll still be subject to replanting requirements. It's just if they're subject to this process where we post it online and require an arborist report and then, or send large tree removals to the city commission. But they will always be subject to removal and replacement. There's multiple layers of standards that apply, so we're just adding another layer.
Was that part of the site plan? Is that part of land use?
No, they just took them out.
We would either, if it was part of a development,
Yeah, they just took them out.
yeah, we'll either review them as a street tree removal permit, which is a process that we do over the counter, which is free of charge, or we'll do it as a site plan design review application through a public noticed process.
But that really only, the city forcing the property owner to replace the tree only happens if someone realizes it was taken away and calls them on it, correct?
Yeah, we get a lot of people that want to do the right thing, and we do code enforcement, but I'm sure there's a lot of people that get away with nothing, except for...
How do we know about it unless they go through a process to remove them?
Sometimes we hear about them when a neighbor comes in and asks the question.
Oh, I know.
So we will often see them in neighborhood batches where they'll then call in all their neighbors where there was a tree removed, but it is hard to keep up on.
Can I?
It's a lot easier to keep up on it if we have
Commissioner Smith, most of those happen on the weekends.
One at a time.
And that's been part of the problem.
I know that. That's my whole point. My point is if they had to come to us before they removed them, it would be a lot less of us having to guess whether or not they disappeared in the middle of the night or whether or not someone's watching them every day like they do the school district. So, I think it's a argument for those trees to follow the same guidelines as all the other trees in the right-of-way.
Just to clarify, all trees in the right-of-way that need removal need a permit through us. So the ones that we don't know about are the ones that are just not asking, or we're not finding out through code enforcement. But everyone right now has to come to us for a permit before removal of a tree.
How many of the trees that are removed actually come to us for a permit, do you think?
All the other ones I know of, because we'll make them get a permit and go through approval. So I don't know how many have been removed that I'm unaware of.
All the other ones as opposed to just the ones at Barclay? I mean, people cut down trees in the right-of-way all the time without a permit.
I don't know exactly how many we do per year, but I would guess
What
between
happened in the last year?
maybe 440 permits a year.
Mr. Lewis.
So good discussion. I just kind of, the piece that I struggle with on this is we have tree code that applies to the city adopted tree code that was well-oiled machine, does for that private property owner, and really for city staff, that code applies. It deals with these things like street trees. Now, what I'm hearing is we'd like that to be more constrained or have a heavier requirement to avoid tree removals, right? That's citywide. That's a policy decision that we haven't really heard from the commission yet, but we're hearing it, right? And Denise, I think loud and clear from you, you'd like to see citywide more tree protection. And that seems like that's a city code piece. This policy and process for tree removals was intended to be specific about the city staff, the city's property, and how we can avoid what happened in the pool scenario. So this looks pretty closely at that. How does staff work and work with the commission to get approval of those trees? And we're trying to apply that language, which is on top of the existing tree code, to everybody now. And I think that gets confusing. I think if we really want to look at tree protections citywide, that's a different conversation. This was supposed to be pretty focused on how does the Public Works Department or the Parks Department work with trees in a way that's affordable. One of the things that I have, and doesn't mean that it's necessarily going to be a new budget request, but yeah, we have to manage a fair amount of tree issues in the right-of-way. And I'll be honest with you, we're not really in that strong a position to want to remove trees necessarily. There's times when we have to remove trees for sight distance, for crosswalk visibility, those kind of things. But we don't necessarily choose to want to remove those. And most of those trees that we're dealing with aren't the large-scale walnut or the trees on this list, because these aren't typically kind of street trees and the trees that are in the right-of-way. So, but what concerned me was, you know, if we have to go through too much process that involves arborists, posting, the staff that do that are the same staff that are out there paving your streets and sweeping your streets. So it's we're not proposing at this point in time hiring, but I think it's important for you to know that that means that's less service that they provide on those other things. So that's why I like this idea where we were kind of working on an internal policy to make sure that we've got two good checks. And if there's really a challenge to that, the city manager has an opportunity to take a swing at it as well. And then on those cases when it really needs commission authority, we have a mechanism for getting it there. So that's kind of what I think we definitely need to bifurcate the public and that whole tree policy piece from what we're trying to accomplish internal to tree removals and appropriate tree removals.
Okay.
Could we separate the discussion maybe in terms of, is this policy, where are we at on this policy as it relates to the city? And then there's a discussion about, do we want to go further? Because honestly, that's a whole different process, right? To get into creating a permit system, some type of probably a land use, you know, typically what we've seen is some type of a land use process for tree removal. You know, so I think those are, I agree with John. I think these are kind of two separate conversations, and can we deal with one related to what Laura and John have put together, and then maybe have that discussion about where do we want to go next to, you know, as it relates to tree preservation in the community. Because I hear both. I mean, I understand the frustration of, you know, it's kind of an honor system. I mean, that we understand that. We've come a long way in terms of you actually have to get a permit if we find it, you know, even retroactively. But, you know, this would be that next step if you want to go along to all private property owners have to go through some type of a process, land use or other public noticed approval process. You know, I think that's a much different probably conversation to get to that, and maybe the direction is start working on that, but I'm not sure we can just tweak this and apply it.
I would agree with that. I like keeping this current policy narrowly focused, and that I agree that the other conversation is a much broader conversation that would need to happen. I
can't raise my hand on the screen, so.
Ms. Turway, you were going through a list of items. You were on the whether or not it applied to all trees in the public right-of-way question. Do we have general consensus that we're not going to head down that road at this point, that we're going to stay focused on this internal policy on the city? Thumbs up, I see. Okay. Did you have additional items, Mr. Way?
No, I noted the staff education related to trees. I think you hit the nail on the head, Commissioner McGriff, that we don't have a city arborist. And so we're making it work with people from different departments that have education related to trees. And then I noted comments related to selling wood for market value and then working with woodworkers groups.
And I'll try to get you that name.
Great.
I have it written down somewhere, I just don't have it with me.
Perfect.
So, Ms. Turway, I guess my only remaining issue with this policy is that I feel like the policy should apply to all trees greater than 50 dBH no matter what. And it reads at the top that they must be on this list and meet the size requirement. And I can't tell when I read this makes me think that the section down below which addresses city commission approval of city-owned trees over 50 dBH. It's hard for me to, it makes me think that the overarching at the very top is saying that if it's 50 dBH, it still has to meet, it still has to be one of those trees in the list at the top, correct?
No, if you look at the bottom, it says other deciduous tree species, other evergreens. It leaves the door open for other, is that correct? Other trees?
That is correct. If you had a tree that was 50 dBH, this would not apply if it was one of the exemptions. So if it was a nuisance species or something like that, it
Like
wouldn't
a tree
apply.
of heaven?
But it should apply, yes, we have the capture for deciduous trees 20 inches or greater, or evergreen 18 inches or greater. So.
But what if it were a ponderosa pine? So you're saying the other categories essentially will take care of any tree that's 50 dBH?
Yep. Any species essentially over 20 inches would then get captured.
If we had a catalpa tree that for some reason was on city property, it's not on this list, but it's over 50 dBH, it would be,
It would still
fall into
list.
this category.
Assuming it's not a nuisance species, yes.
I don't believe it
Or
is.
one of the exemptions, yeah.
Okay.
We used to have several monkey trees in Oregon City that were over 50 dBH, but they kind of died of natural causes.
Okay, so I think you have everything. Any other final comments from the commission?
You got clear?
Yep. You have everything you need?
I have clear direction, so I'm going to take this, go to Natural Resources and PRAC, and then I will come back to you guys with a resolution.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
All right, we're going to move on to number 3, which is small cell design and construction standards review. Mr. Lewis.
Thank you, Commissioners. So I just want to point out that you get this presentation of Dante Posadas, who's our right-of-way and construction manager, he put the lion's share of work into the packet and into the presentation. And tonight he's dealing with a tough toothache, and he's sitting at home watching and zoomed in, but I committed to kind of giving the presentation. So we've really got 6 slides to go through. I would say that the report and the packet that you had was extensive, and the idea there was not to cover all that information again, but really to provide you some information. I guess the other thing is this presentation has been something of a group discussion between community development, Laura, myself, and Dante. So we've got a fair amount of equity in this, and the commission does as well. So I'm going to go through that. So in 2019 and really much of 18, we talked about small cell to a large extent. And in the staff report, there's a lot of evidence of that. We've been talking through this. And the reason why we're here tonight is because we brought forth kind of a broad brush overview of some code changes that we're planning to bring forward and take through the land use process. And in doing that, we shared the various items that we thought were significant enough to kind of share with the commission so that they knew what was coming. And this was one of those items that we heard some concern about or some feedback on. And so we felt like, given the amount of discussion and effort that it went into adoption of Resolution 1903, that we maybe needed to share a little bit more of that information. So that was what was in the packet. I apologize for the length of the packet, but there was a lot of good information about how we got to a place where we've got a resolution and really some design standards for small cell. So we want to talk through that a little bit with you and just make sure you're recognizing that work. And then the other piece is to gain support for this idea of moving forward with code amendments that would exempt those small cell projects, applying the resolution 1903 and those design standards and applying other code that we have, but exempting it from the land use code 1780, chapter 1780, so that we're not duplicating things. So we also want to talk about 1780 a little bit and kind of share how those overlap and why and I guess we originally, when we presented Resolution 1903, we presented that with the understanding and the explanation to the commission that we wanted to bring forward the code change to 1780, but that was a land use process that we wanted to group. So we're trying to keep that ball moving forward so we stay in compliance with the FCC code, state law, and now our own resolution and code. So, and there's a series of pictures that Dante included in here. These are all small cell depictions that show up throughout the few slides that we have here. They're all taken in Portland, from what I recall, or from the metro region anyway. So just know that those are examples of small cell that have been installed in the Portland area. And
I'm not sure what I'm looking at when I'm looking at, I mean, I looked at the whole packet, but what am I looking at? Is it the white thing or is it the brown thing? Or is it both things?
Yeah, it's definitely the piece at the top.
Okay.
The conduits in between, and the box sitting on the power pole there.
Yeah,
so.
I apologize, but that was not clear to me what it was I was looking at.
Okay, yeah, and each one of them looks a little different. To be honest with you, it's what we see is technology that's transitioning into much more standard form, but in our design standard, and really that design standard is informed by the FCC regulation, there is some ability to require a certain look of these things and size, but it's pretty broad, and it's a federal regulation that we really kind of had to work within. So, but in this case right here, yeah, there's definitely wiring. There's some exposed wiring. I would say this is one of the newer installations, but we see designs that look much better than that.
That's not very attractive.
In fact, we included that in the package as well, was what AT&T has actually submitted on a small cell. So we included their design package in the information that we provided you. So small cells, you know, we've got a variety of companies that are looking at them. Most of them have a fair amount of infrastructure in place already. So the two that we have in town are Verizon and AT&T. They're actually pretty active and have been installing facilities in other jurisdictions throughout the metro area. So, but there's others too that are looking at it. And in fact, you know, a smart business plan might be, hey, you've got plenty of fiber in the ground. You still have to have fiber to these facilities. They still have to have power to these facilities. So, you know, if you have those kinds of things, it may make sense in your business plan to put in the small cell that could be leased to others for use. So we may see more of that. We're not quite sure. We haven't seen that yet, but we anticipate seeing that. So, you know, yes, this is what they're proposing. So it's basically an antenna that's on an existing either street light, you'll see examples of that, or power poles. So they're working really with existing facilities to install these facilities. And I've heard, you know, other presentations that, you know, as the 5G network becomes more and more the norm, we're going to see, you know, more of these throughout jurisdictions. And, you know, the idea of that 5G is that it provides better service. It really kind of takes some of the load that's on our current system and puts it on a different kind of network and frequency. So, but it's basically an antenna. We're hearing about it now, so it's very active program right now. We anticipate small cell facilities. What FCC is requiring is that they require them to be allowed in the public right-of-way. So we're seeing them there. We may see them on private property as well. And in some cases that makes sense, you know, because it might look better on a building than it would look on a power pole. And, you know, why is it? Well, because basically the telecommunication industry, its network, especially with the pandemic, we're finding that the amount of data requirement that the existing network is needing was already, even before the pandemic, was anticipated to be overloaded. So this 5G is a better way of a new and up-and-coming way of dealing with data processing. So, and I guess the other reason for this is this need has been recognized at a federal level. So we were, if you remember back in the time, we were making, or back in 2018 and 19, we were making progress on this, and the FCC issued a ruling requiring that we either adopt their ruling or adopt our own. And we chose to adopt our own, which was much more rigid than what the FCC had to offer. So, but the idea was to accelerate this wireless broadband across the nation.
So, Mr. Lewis, just to clarify for the public and anybody who's listening to this, we've received quite a number of emails from folks who are saying that they do not support 5G. They're asking the city commission to not allow it in the city. But it sounds like, from what you just said, that we are essentially following federal law that is requiring us to allow 5G. Is that true?
That's true. So, you know,
So it's kind of out of our control. We either have a resolution that provides design standards that meets, shapes it a little bit more to what we would find more acceptable, or we're just not compliant with federal law.
That's correct.
Or you rely on federal law standards.
Or we rely
on the federal standards, right? And so that's one of the reasons why we moved to go through the land use adoption process, where it was transparent. We had, you know, we published our intent to move forward with design standards. And so, that land use adoption process, if you will, was followed with public noticing, and we didn't get a lot of that kind of feedback at that time. But I understand, you know, as these technologies become more and more, and I think the community conversation at both the local level and the federal level become more evident, you start hearing more of those folks with concern over any kind of you know, wireless network.
Right. I think it helps all of us be on the same page as far as what a potential response may be if we get these emails. I know I've gotten quite a few, and so I just wanted to reiterate and make sure I heard you correctly, so that I thought it might be a good point to press on and make sure we were all on the same page. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, because I think it's an excellent point.
Mr. Lewis, sir? Since I was not specifically aware or involved in Resolution 1903, I read your entire packet. I'm going to tell you that this is not a topic that I am well versed in. I don't know very much about it. I've also seen the emails. I had numerous discussions with people about whatever. Well, the 5G basically stands for it's the fifth generation of the wave carrier that carries signals and does whatever it does. I get a little nervous when I see the word that these carriers want to be exempt from something, because as you said, the federal standard is pretty loose. So that says to me a couple of things, that there's been a lot of lobbying by the telecommunications industry to make these requirements as thin as possible so that they can kind of do what they want. I'm just making that broad assumption because that's generally what happens. What I do appreciate is the fact that we're looking at from the standpoint of that we want, you know, if we're talking about putting these things all over our neighborhoods in Oregon City, I don't support the picture, because that's really very unattractive. And I do think aesthetics has something to do with it. And so if we have a standard that would be better, and there's a better design solution, you know, the least obtrusive appearance-wise would be preferable in my book, because, you know, when I'm walking, driving, I'm looking at everything. Even though I have my eye on the road, you can see everything's going around. And, you know, Oregon City looks pretty good. We don't need to junk it up with more stuff that looks like that. So I guess part of the issue that I have, or not an issue, but the concern I have, so you, in all your material, try to define the problem that we're trying to solve. And I found it in a variety of places in your document, but I didn't find a succinct sort of what is the problem we're trying to solve, and why do we want to exempt something from public notification or public, whatever the review is. Why do we want to exempt something? Again, I get a little nervous when I see the word exemption.
Right, well,
You're about to get to that, right?
You're about to get there? Okay.
Yeah, and if I miss it, well, I don't think I'll miss it.
I'm listening.
But I believe Resolution 1903 that we passed last year allowed us to set design standards, et cetera, helped us put at least a little bit of some guidepost on that.
Right. We were trying to take what I agree with you in that I think that the telecommunications industry had been working pretty hard with the federal government to get to a standard, and their standard was a little bit loose, and the region, I mean, there's several folks like Dante who were at the table trying to figure out how to deal with what was coming in terms of federal regulation, because we got some precursor of what that might look like. And so, I felt like we took kind of the leadership role in trying to establish a design that we could work with, that we could monitor and clear and objective standards, right, Laura? That's right. That's the term used there. So, I mean, it was. I think we put a lot of energy into that and still staying compliant with that FCC ruling. And, part of the reason why we would, right now we've got duplication in our code and our standard. And that we knew we were going to have that. And we knew we needed to fix that. And so there's that. And then there's also the fact that the FCC not only has kind of loose design standards, but they set a specific shot clock on how much time was involved in approving these facilities.
Of course.
And a specific limit on how much we could charge for those. So we exceeded the limit on the charge. There was not an opportunity really for the shot clock, but on the charge, there was a provision in there that said, well, you have to justify your numbers. So we went through that exercise as well to justify the charges. If we take our resolution, and actually the fees were in resolution 1903 or 1902, but if we took those and also had the land use fees associated with the 1780 and the land use approval process, we would struggle. We would have to go back and validate whether or not that was appropriate for approval of a small cell. So, I mean, all these things we were thinking of, Commissioner McGriff, and I know I'd be happy to sit down and talk through these with you. In fact, some of the standards and some of the details in that FCC order are buried, not in this package. We didn't include that, but they are. We still have them, obviously, and they're buried in a lot of the discussions that we had with the commission in 2018 and 19.
So what you're saying, the problem we're trying to solve?
The problem we're trying to solve is we've got duplication of code, and so and that is what we're trying to show you tonight, where that's at and how we think what 1903 offers in terms of the resolution is a better solution for small cell. 1780 was mostly written, as far as I can tell, for things like cell towers, monopoles, those large facilities that show up in neighborhoods that have, had a lot of controversy associated with them. These small cells are definitely much smaller facilities. I think they're moving in the right direction from technology. I think whatever standard we come up with today may change tomorrow. So, we took a good shot at that, and that is going to be a work in progress. So, anyway, we've got really that federal communication, their order that was quite limiting in terms of what we could do to deal with aesthetic guidelines and what we could do with fees, and it established that shot clock. And so we worked within those requirements, just like every other agency in the metro region, and not everybody adopted the exact same language, but very similar to what we had. Then we have our right-of-way management code, which is 1324 deals with telecommunications. 1334 is about our ability to manage the right-of-way, charge fees, those kinds of things. And then right now, what we're talking about is exemption from Chapter 17. And, so right now there's a variety of chapters that, that conflict with what we've adopted in 1903. And we knew that when we adopted that. So we put together some short comparison slide. There's obviously a lot of details, but I was trying to get through this in a relatively quick manner. 1903 really addresses several issues that 1780 doesn't. And so we've kind of checked the ones that it does. Land use permit process is, I think, the beauty of the land use process is it has a lot of opportunities for public involvement, a lot of opportunities for, making adjustments if we can find other ways to enforce other requirements. And usually that's time intensive. And, with the pre-application, then the application, there's a fair amount of fees associated with that as well. So we put most of our effort into the adoption of Resolution 1903. And I would say that even with 1780, given the type of facilities we're talking about, the amount of, public involvement would still be limited. And so we think that these facilities they're up and coming. We're going to see more of them. We think that our standard does a better job of addressing the kind of things the community would be concerned about, with things like noise and size and types of signage. Does it meet a particular electrical code? Are there plans? Is there a site plan associated with them? If you looked in the packet, there was an extensive submittal for the application that AT&T has provided, so that we wouldn't have gotten that out of 1780. So that's where we think the Commission's decision in 2019 was a good one, and we're just trying to better maintain our compliance with FCC requirements. So again, if there's questions, I'm happy to answer them for sure. I guess what we're trying to look forward is the Commission, based on what they've heard tonight and what they saw in the packet, comfortable with the staff moving forward with this request for exemption with our code changes. That keeps us in alignment with federal regulation. It deals with the shot clock and compensation for fees. That's our recommendation and ask. If we don't do that, then we really kind of have some major rethinking to do with what we adopted in 2019, because we would have both that would apply, and we would have to figure out how to deal with those conflicts and how to do that on a timeline that works for the federal rules.
Thank you, Mr. Lewis. Commissioner O'Donnell.
There'll be some comments and some questions. The first comment on a positive note is we know that we need increased internet capability. I mean, and the way things are going, we're relying on homeschooling and everything else. So that's the upside. The reality is, and this is just life in the big city, the big players in here, the lobbyists and all, you can see this thing is weighted so heavily in favor of the providers. And that's because they're back there greasing the palms and making campaign contributions and lobbyists and everything else. And that's reality, and it's ugly, and that's life. I've got more questions and answers on this. We talked about, is there any provision for shared towers? We talked about cosmetics. We talked about really there's no standardization. I don't want this city looking like a porcupine with all these towers sticking up in it. And at one point in a previous presentation, I was more concerned about the density of towers needed to services. For some reason, I thought it was like 9 per square mile. And I don't remember what the coverage was, Mr. Lewis, but it was fairly dense saturation of towers. And man, looking at that tower you showed us, that thing is like beyond ugly, and it looks like it could easily be at least 2/3 higher than the existing the pole. So then, there's the questions specifically are, what are our impacts on right-of-way you know, and our ability to share and others to use our right-of-ways. If we start putting these people in there, you know, apparently we've got a fee schedule that is justifiable, and you've come to that conclusion, and I don't know what that is. I don't like the moving totally from 17.8 to 19.03, because my understanding is it pretty much excludes public comment, and I don't know if that's correct or not. So I'm also concerned about the way the darn thing is phrased. You know, staff has 10 days. You have to respond within 10 days. Can you do that? If you get a saturation of applications, can you respond to all those in 10 days? Because in the absence of a response, even in the way the thing is written, even if it's erroneous or faulty or lacks information, it goes through. A lot of questions.
Is that 10 business days or 10 calendar days?
I thought it was calendar, but I don't recall.
Yeah, I'll have to look into that for sure. But I mean, my understanding is there's provisions that allow for over, you know, there's recognition that community still has review authority, and if the volume of requests is too high, there's recognition of that. I don't remember the details of that, but there was provisions in the FCC guidelines that kind of acknowledge that potential exists out there, and it could overcome the local authority's ability to handle that. So there is some provision for that, but I don't remember the exact language.
John, can I jump in here? Hi guys, good evening. This is Dante Posadas, the right-of-way and construction manager. So the FCC guidelines establish a 60-day period for the city to make a final decision on small cells. It is not a 10-day period. So the city has 60 days to make their decision if their small cell is per standard and per federal guidelines. Secondly, to Frank's question about densification, Resolution 1903 establishes that separation and clearance requirements for sitting of small cells within the right-of-way. No licensee can place a small cell within 300 feet of another one of their facilities. So the densification wouldn't be every utility pole. It would be more or less maybe one per block. That is in guidelines with the Federal Communications Commission. Secondly, we would only allow one licensee to be placed on a utility pole. That is to minimize the impacts that the city sees for relocations within the right-of-way, minimize the impact that the city has when we have to regulate PGE or regulate any of the other telecommunications for relocations. So that, all of those things, I think address Frank's question. Then Resolution 19-03 really sets apart these standards, going over the size, the location, the prohibited locations of where small cells can be within the right-of-way, the type of utility poles that they can use within the right-of-way, just color, height, wiring. It really touches on everything that the Federal Communications Commission allowed local right-of-way jurisdiction to place standards for. While 17.80 only talks through the co-location of existing wireless facilities or the promotion of those wireless facilities, while 17.80 does talk to some sizing and does talk to allowing for small cells to be placed on utility poles, 19.03 dials in those standards to say that a small cell antenna can't be more than 3 cubic feet on top of a pole. So The presentation that John showed earlier with the pictures of small cells within Portland, the one small cell on Tacoma Avenue that you guys saw that you're saying is a really tall, ugly thing, it would not be allowed within Oregon City. It would, so if you go one more slide. This would not be allowed in Oregon City because it goes over the 28 cubic feet, and the antenna is over 3 cubic feet. And Resolution 19-03 establishes those standards. City Code 17.80 does not establish those standards.
Okay, Commissioner O'Donnell, would you like to follow up?
Yeah, I would, yeah. Dante, listen to what you're saying. If these things are allowed to be within 300 feet of each other, and a square mile is 5,300 feet on a side, we can have 17 of these lineally by one provider on one side of a square mile. And then the other question is, if we're going to have more than one provider, did you say we will or will not have more than one provider?
We will.
Okay.
I mean,
so
right now there's 2 licensed providers for telecommunication industry in Oregon City under the right-of-way program, which is Ordinance 131014. But we also have, hold on one second. We have a total of 49 communication providers within the city, and 15 of those are licensees, which are allowed to place facilities within the right-of-way. So the other portion of this is that we have a right-of-way program, and the right-of-way program oversees all utility installations within the right-of-way, and that right-of-way program also collects fees for the use of the right-of-way. And in making small cells go through land use or making small cells have more stringent standards, we are going against the federal communications rulings because we are not allowed to make any telecommunication industry standard more stringent than other utility installations within the right-of-way. So I understand where you're coming from, saying that we could have 17 along a street, but we have, from a federal communication regulation standpoint, their argument to that would be, well, you have 100 transformers on the poles too. So how can you regulate one utility different than regulating another utility when the internet is a necessity, as you said?
See, transformers aren't that dense, but not to be argumentative. I mean, if there's more than one provider and I can't have one antenna within 300 of another, is that just even between providers, or say provider A has an antenna at 1 foot, 300 feet, and 600 feet, and provider B, does he come in at 150 and then 300 feet from that? Or do we get this dual saturation? Or is there any provision for them sharing towers so we don't have this densification?
I think the market, in a lot of ways, is going to control that, Commissioner O'Donnell, because, you know, the other little problem that each of these has is they got to provide a power source and they got to provide fiber to that facility. So we're going to see fiber owners be more likely to be the providers of these small cells or the suppliers of these small cells. And I think you're going to see the market lease. You know, whoever's got the small cell is going to lease that facility to others through various forms of agreements. So, I mean, yes, we've got lots of users of the right of way, and yes, there's, you know, potential for competing interests on one side of the street versus the other. Our rules limit them to 300-foot spacing, whether that's one provider or 3. And so, you know, but at the end of the day, we see this technology both getting more compact and smaller, and more likely to be led by those folks who have fiber in place.
I guess, but what's the answer to the question, though? If you have a provider on this pole, can provider B come in 10 feet away?
No,
Okay, so all
300 feet.
300 feet, so you can't, regardless of who the provider is.
Right.
Because when Dante was saying, he said a provider can't be within 300 feet of their pole. So
My recollection, Dante, am I wrong about that?
Yes, you are wrong, John. It has to be the same provider. So AT&T can't put another small cell within 300 feet of their small cell. But if AT&T puts a small cell on Malala and Holmes, Verizon could come and put a small cell on, I don't know, Mountain View and Holmes, or Mount Hood and Holmes, or Mount
300
Hood
feet
and
away?
Malala, which is less than 300 feet or whatever. So each provider can put an antenna within, each provider has a 300-foot radius to put antennas in.
That doesn't make any sense.
And that's regulation because of the utilities and because of the federal communication regulation and rulings on what the city can or cannot do aesthetically for small cells.
Well, the bottom line is this is going to get shoved down municipalities' throats for the reasons I said. And so what you said, Dante, is I could have a tower or an antenna at 0 feet, 300 feet, 600 feet. I could also have a second antenna by another provider at 150, 450, and et cetera. So I could have dual saturation. I mean, single saturation on a square mile. If you do 17 times 17, that's 289 towers in a square mile. I don't know if that's reality, and hopefully it will be market driven, but it's ugly and it's going to be forced down our throats.
Yes, I would agree. So our action tonight, I think we can be unhappy about the FCC regulations. The resolution 1903, we were trying to make it to comply while also providing some design standards to hopefully make it a little bit more palatable. So tonight, your presentation is to provide direction, is to ask us for direction regarding clearing up our code, just removing duplication to make sure that it's clear for the providers who are coming in and submitting permits. Is that correct?
That's correct. We're trying to get to, we want to move forward with all of our code changes. This is one of many, and we just don't want to go through that process and then, get in front of the city commission and have them say, why is this here?
Right. Commissioner Smith. You're muted.
Have we not, we've already created these design standards then?
Yes, we have. They're in the design standards were in the packet, so yes, we've created them.
Well, okay. In terms of visuals, the one submitted by AT&T basically fits our design criteria.
Yes, Dante, my recollection is that package that's included in there would be approved if we could avoid they're waiting because they actually are proceeding with land use approval process for that one because they're trying to get their shot clock in. So yeah, so the one that's in the packet here that doesn't show up meets our design standard.
Could you put that one up on the screen?
Maybe.
I mean, I see the design, but what does it look like in real life?
Right.
I don't agree with that.
We have no visuals of any of this, so I don't understand. I'm having a hard time.
Yeah, we have a kind of a design drawing of what that looks like in the packet, and I don't know how much of that we can get to, but it's pretty deep in the information that we submitted.
Well, there's a design sheet number A4, which is page 12 of 37. If you download from the packet, Appendix B.
I thought it was
They're the same thing.
Oh, is it the same?
Yeah, that's the AT&T proposal, right?
Yeah.
Right, that's what you were asking about, correct?
Right, so that's the only visual we have of what our guidelines are.
Of how it would meet it, yeah.
Company, what they're gonna do. We don't have our own.
No,
So he's asking, do we have any examples as part of Resolution 1903 of what is acceptable design standards for the city? You put this AT&T proposal in our packet. This is an example, and you're saying it does meet our standards, but I believe Commissioner Smith's question is, do we have any pictures or examples of 5G facilities that meets our design standards?
Yes, my concern is, one, that there's a lot of variables in what fit our design. So to me, if you have the amount of towers that Commissioner O'Donnell was referencing versus the different companies, and there's a variation on how many different designs each of those companies can submit and how they can be installed, then you're not only going to have one eyesore, but you're going to have 15 different eyesores that are not consistent across the city. To me, you know, it's one, how the installation of each one looks, but also how that's consistent throughout the city. If you have some on poles and some on streetlights and some on other things, and they all look different, then that just adds to the complexity and the eyesore and negates really the point of having a design standard in the first place. So, you know, if I'm looking at this AT&T thing, the proposal, and know that every single company that installs one after this is going to look exactly like that, even though I don't think it's the most attractive, at least it's consistent with what's going to be throughout the city. But I don't know that looking at any of the documents I've received here. So in my mind, what we're saying is any company that comes to us, as long as they fit with our design standards, which I have really no idea what that looks like, it's going to be accepted. And therefore, we could have variations all throughout the city that look different.
So I do believe, I don't recall a design standard. We showed a lot of photos of existing examples, but you're right. The design standard provides more flexibility than that. And so that, which is consistent with what we were, what we have and what the industry is allowed to do. So it's got more things like how many square feet that electrical box can be, and how much volume the antenna itself can be, and how those wires are contained. But they could all look different. Now I think the industry is going to get to more of a standard than anything else, but there's still we still see changes to that. So you know, I think what we're seeing on AT&T is probably the latest, which is getting much cleaner. Will that continue to improve? I believe it will, but right now that's we can't depict, you know, specifically what those facilities can look like in our standards.
Okay, so that we're talking about our standards. We really don't have any.
We have design standards, yes, but they've got flexibility within those design standards, so they're not prescriptive. They don't you know, it's like most design standards. They give some constraints to the design, but they don't specifically say exactly what it has to look like.
Well, then honestly, I don't know that there's a question for us. If they want to install pretty much anything and are telling us to do it, that they should do it. Well, doesn't sound like we have much input on anything.
Well, the reason why we do have input is because we have local authority over the right-of-way, and that's why we're trying to set up a standard that fits with the federal regulations that they are overseeing us on. So I understand where you're coming from, Commissioner Smith, and yes, we don't have a uniform small cell. What we do have is standards that outline guidelines for size, color, location, anything within the right-of-way that we were allowed to regulate aesthetically per the FCC ruling. So yes, there is that ambiguity that the providers can have, and they have fought really hard with the Federal Communications Commission to get that ambiguity. But Oregon City, as the local authority in our right-of-way, what we did was we established standards that followed that federal guideline to as much as we could, so that we don't have the 12-foot antennas on top of utility poles, or that we don't have blue clusters in the right-of-way, that they have to be an aesthetically pleasing color. They can't have any noise coming from them, stuff like that. So, yes, you're right in the manner that there is no complete uniformity on if there is a certain type of antenna or a cluster antenna or something like that, but there is, what city staff is trying to do is maintain its local right-of-way authority, which we established in Chapter 13, or Chapter 13.34, so that we can regulate the utilities within the right-of-way. And the federal government has pretty much said that these telecommunication companies are a utility within the right-of-way, and that they are planning to accelerate the deployment of this utility because of the need for the internet.
Okay, so if there's all these different variations in designs and different installations and all of that, we can't even as a city require them to be consistent on where they're located. For instance, can they install these? They can install these on PGE poles, but they can also install these on our street lights.
Yeah.
So there are
no consistent way to say you can do one or the other, but not both.
There are some prohibited.
Communications Commission. Go ahead, John.
So there are not a lot of restrictions, but there are some. So in the standard, there's prohibited locations, like the elevator, for instance, city-owned decorative streetlights, city scenic views, city street frontages along historic points, signage, support structures. So there are some prohibited locations, but
I remember that discussion. I mean, when cities spend a fortune to remove, utility poles and underground utilities and spend a fortune to install decorative streetlights, then how do we get repaid for the eyesores that were being forced upon us? I just don't understand it.
We also have a no new pole requirement. So, they're looking at existing corridors that have existing overhead in them.
So there was a classification for streets. You'd start with expressways, major arterial, minor arterial, or collector, then a local, then support structures, third-party utility pole, third-party street lights, city-owned infrastructure, and then John talked about the 5 identified prohibited locations. And so with the no street pole, what you're probably going to see then is focusing on, if let's just say we did an undergrounding of all the utilities and we put in decorative lighting.
Sure.
Can't put it on the decorative lighting, can't put in a new pole. You're probably going to see them focused on street. What am I thinking of? Stoplights. Signals. So they would be incorporated into the signal pole shrouding or in that. And
It's a decorative signal pole.
The problem is that those are decorative too, so
Right.
so I don't see how that's possible.
Not all of them are decorative.
Those match our streetlights.
But doesn't all that work to our favor, though? I mean, that's good. I mean, it essentially greatly restricts the amount of poles that they that are available for these structures. So the more decorative street poles we have, the better.
Right.
Unless what you're saying is that those don't count, those traffic signal lights don't count. To me, they know legally what they do, but no, I think it gives us an incentive to start going away from power poles.
Commissioner O'Donnell.
Following up on Commissioner Rocky Smith's question, and this question is directed to staff, how far Yeah, it talks about the many shapes these things can take. I mean, if you specify it in terms of cubic feet, you know, one could be a cylinder, one could be an octagon or hexagon, one could be round. Can we specify an allowable geometric shape that we would allow in this city, that all these housings must be, and give them an approved manufacturer that their housing needs to fit into? Can we push it that far and not run afoul of the FCC and these laws?
Are you referring to more than, so for example, small cell wireless communication antenna, maximum surface area of 3 cubic feet? And then wireless telecommunication facilities, total combined volume of all above ground equipment comprising a small cell wireless communication facility exclusive of the antenna shall be a maximum of 28 cubic feet. So we've narrowed it that way, but you're talking more of like it needs to be a rectangle or a square. Is that what I'm hearing?
You are. I mean,
Yeah.
28, whatever the number of cubic feet is, can take many different geometric forms. One can come in with a sphere, one can come in with a cylinder, one can come in with a square. You know, can we standardize that so at least it's not the eyesore that Commissioner Smith is describing?
So the FCC regulation does not allow that kind of specificity. So
I don't know if you're sure.
The space.
You're sure of that statement?
Yeah.
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 Commissioner McGriff.
Yeah, just a couple of questions. So I looked through the packet, so it looks like the application is going to be on a pole that is, I forget what the name of the Chinese restaurant is, I should know what it is, on the corner of Holmes and Malala, that looks like where they want it to go. I can see the pole, and I just drove by there today. So that was pretty clear to me that they want to do that. So I guess Mr. Conkle read the licensees shall install facilities according to the priority. So basically, Collector Street and a local street would be the last two options that you're saying that the priority is going to be. So we want it on an expressway first, or a major arterial or minor arterial, and that's the hierarchy. And that's on page 27 of the packet. So that makes sense. Is there anything in the standards that says that the minimum has to be 300 feet, or could we say the minimum is 500 feet? I'm just throwing a number out. I'm not saying that that's the right number, but.
You're talking about distance between poles?
Yeah. Small cell wireless communications shall be installed and maintained by the same licensee. There shall be a minimum of 300 horizontal feet apart.
Right.
Yeah.
So the reason why we are doing 300 feet is because that's industry practice. We consulted with industry, we consulted with other local agencies, we consulted with the League of Oregon Cities. There have been different thought processes that small cells can range between 200 and 500 feet for the processing of data and being able to be used in the manner that they're designed for. In Oregon City, we have a lot of different topography. We have a lot of different trees. And I'm not making an excuse. I understand.
No. So you're saying that there's some requirement
and
to get the signals back and forth.
But
okay.
It was based off of the industry standard of 300 feet.
Okay, so in collaboration with Commissioner Smith's comments, so we have some decorative signal poles in the city, particularly on the 7th Street corridor. So would someone be allowed to put something on top of one of those?
No.
Okay, so that's decorative. So then my last question on this particular item is, one of the concerns that I received verbally had to do with property that is under the jurisdiction of Title 1740. Which is basically dealing with our historic districts. So 1740 regulates things. So for instance, to Tony, you might have been here at the time, but do you recall the cell tower that they wanted to put up that was going to look like it was going to replicate a mill structure in the middle of the McLaughlin neighborhood? Anyway, that was, yes, it was proposed. It was quite the application. Anyway, it would have been, it didn't meet the conditional use permit standards, I assure you. It was not good. So I don't think any of these will be designed like a tree or a tower from the mill or anything of that sort. But what I'm thinking about is in terms of visual impact in historic districts. So I'll just use myself as an example. We do not have any decorative poles along the street that I live in. There are just wood poles. So technically they could come in and put some on those wood poles.
Technically they could.
Yeah, I mean, I hope they don't put one next to my house because the angle where that pole is next to my house is like a shot of my house, and I wouldn't want a picture with the cell thing in there, but, so that's a concern. One of the concerns that I received is someone who lives in one of these historic districts, and their concern was the aesthetic value of the district and what that looks like with all these things all over the place, and I said, I don't know how 1740 applies.
Dante, does the FCC ruling address historic districts?
The FCC ruling addresses the conditional use timelines or the land use timeline. So it doesn't necessarily prohibit local authority from going through historic review, but it does prohibit any review in being longer than 60 days. So to Denise's point, when the Public Works Department processes a right-of-way permit for any utility, if there is a Chapter 17 overlay district, we do point the utility to planning to go through the appropriate permitting process. We do not just allow utilities to put stuff in geologic hazard zones or in historical zones and stuff like that, that we would always check with planning on those things. But the other portion of that is that it's a 60-day shot clock. And if we go through conditional use, there are some potential issues with that shot clock timeline.
Well, it may not be a conditional use permit, but it might end up being like a type 2, hey, this is going up in your neighborhood. We've got this much time.
Mr.
Particularly
Ray,
if it's 1740.
can you address the historical district question?
Off the top of my head, I believe that if you wanted to put a small cell in the right-of-way on a light pole or something, it would fall under a definition of major public improvement, which requires historic review board review, but I can get back to you for certain. I know we had this discussion, it was just so long ago.
I know, it's just, it got asked.
I remember feeling comforted by the answer, so I'm pretty sure that's what it is.
So if you point them in the right direction and there's some minor process that goes within that 60 days, I think it would cover just about anything, and I'm okay with that.
Okay, Commissioner O'Donnell.
I'm going to say why I don't want to be the industry leader in this technology. And it's simply because as technology improves, my hope is that the range of these individual units will increase. And as is the custom in electronics, the size of them generally goes down. So the first generation equipment is usually the crudest and most ugly. So I'm not in a hurry to do this, is how I'll phrase it. And I'm not sure what Dante is saying. I understand the 60 days, but I read a thing that said if an application is put in for approval on I think it's on an individual tower, staff has 10 days to respond. And if that's not incorrect, please, if that's not correct, feel free to correct me.
Dante?
I do not know that is correct.
I didn't see anything.
The only regulation that the FCC has put is a 60-day shot clock. I mean, staff has to maybe acknowledge that we've received a permit or an inquiry within 10 days, but we do not have to approve or allow for the small cell until 60 days have passed.
I think we should review that, to be clear. I understand both our concerns, and maybe it is a twofold thing. 10 days, but my understanding was even if the other application was incomplete for an individual site, that we had 10 days or else it could be processed as submitted. But that's something that we can look into. We don't need to do that tonight. Thank you.
That in here.
Okay, I would like to make one comment. Commissioner O'Donnell, to address Commissioner O'Donnell's comment, I think it's that we're not trying to be the technology leader. What the City of Oregon City has done with Resolution 1903 is I believe we were a city leader in coming up with our own design standards to try to rein in this overarching and demanding letter of the law and order from the federal government. That was my understanding, was that we were one of the first jurisdictions, local jurisdictions, to kind of come up with our own design standards that we were applying. Is that true, Mr. Lewis?
We're in a much better place with the standard than we would be without the standard. So, yeah, we there were others in front of us, but we were, for the metro area, you know, Portland is obviously well out in front of us, but, you know, other agencies weren't. So and what has been adopted later hasn't changed much. So people have looked to our standard as well. So there is flexibility in the standard, but at the same time, we think that the industry is, I mean, they're understanding the need for their programs to be successful. I don't know. The question is more land use going to frustrate our program or make us feel better about it? And I think staff has a lot of latitude to work with these folks. I think that they're interested in providing a product that is reasonable as long as it's within their capacity to build it, right? They can only get them so small right now. And we're seeing more kind of proposals of things that look round and look more like the top of a pole that you hardly even notice. So I think they're understanding that, but it's an evolution of a new technology. Mm-hmm. That's what we're in.
Commissioner, hang on, pause that. Ms. Turway?
Thank you very much. I just wanted to, so before you tonight is really this recognition that we have land use regulating something before this thing even existed, and then this adoption of these more specific standards that the commission adopted. And so from the zoning perspective, I did hear you say earlier that land use was beautiful, I think, or I'm going to take it that way. But from the zoning perspective, 1780, the chapter that we have that regulates these in the right-of-way, didn't even know these existed. So it's not really well written, and there's not clear and objective standards as to what designs are okay and what are not okay. So for the concerns about the wild variety of designs that come out there, if you use 1780, you are much worse off, because the policy that you adopted has really specific standards, and it has those spacing standards for numbers and things like that. And so the planning division does recommend that the city commission abandon 1780 because you have gone through this public process to adopt more specific standards.
Abandon it just for small cell.
Just for small cell, only in the right-of-way, not on private property, because you've already created more standards, which are more clarity and much more efficient anyway. If we were to go through these public processes, I'm not sure what you would get out of it that you haven't already got with these more specific standards that you adopted through the resolution.
We would probably get complaints about something that we have no ability to change.
That's the concern, is there might be some FCC conflicts within our code as well.
All right, so we should be trying to wrap this up. Yeah. I support the staff's recommendation of trying to clean up. I think it's confusing. We don't need conflicting code. I think our resolution, as Ms. Turway says, does a good job of providing better direction forward, even though we're unhappy with the direction and the regulation by the federal community or by the FCC. And I think that's the direction you were looking for. Commissioner Smith, you had your hand raised.
Yeah, I guess I would just like to, because right now all I know is that the standards that have been given us by the feds is horrible, and our standard is not as bad, but just is, pretty much as ugly, but just not as bad. I would like to be able to at least to the public say, okay, here's what we've done. Right now, I don't know how to compare those two, and to see that what we have done actually makes any difference from the original. And visuals are a great way to do that. We only had the one visual tonight about even one proposal. So I really don't have a clue of what these things are really going to look like and how to really have a conversation with the public who are going to be asking that. And comparing what we're doing with the other standards in a way that's very simple.
Commissioner Smith, we can definitely bring more of that to you. I think when I looked at some of the older presentations, there was a fair amount of examples that weren't as aesthetically pleasing. And so, I think we're trying to be transparent about what they might look like. I'm hoping they look much better. And we're seeing good examples of those that look better. So we can bring more to you, more back. And it sounds like when we go through the code changes, we should emphasize that because I'm sure Planning Commission is going to be concerned about it as well.
So just to recap, this is going to come back to us as code changes in order to support and continue to support Resolution 1903.
Correct.
Is everybody in agreement?
Yeah, just as a one postscript. So I would just like to make a compliment. So 1780 is not poorly written. 1780 doesn't address this type of communication facility. What it does address is other types of communication facility. It is well written. So I want to compliment there. And I thought it was interesting as I was reading through the plans, I had to chuckle because it says whether or not it's in ADA compliance, and it says that it is a facility that is unmanned and not for human habitation. So they want to be perfectly clear that nobody is living there.
And there's 28 square feet.
And 28 square feet. It made me laugh when I saw it because I thought, okay, yeah, they're covering every base that there's possibly is. But anyway, thank you.
Commissioner O'Donnell?
My goal as we will continue to move forward on this is simply to be as restrictive as I can be and as protective of Oregon City as I can be and still fall within the letter of the law. So tight review, we'll get to see this again, everything we can do and toward that goal, that's what I'd like to see. Thank you.
Yeah, so it sounds like
will the design standards come back again, or just the code removing it from 1780?
It will be the code changes that will come back that we're planning to bring back. The design standards are design standards, so we can bring more design standards, but they still need to be within compliance of the.
Right. I guess I just wanted to clarify that.
Right.
Oh, right.
Wanted to see those.
We're planning to bring back code changes that would provide an exemption from 1780.
Right. So we're not planning to bring back design standards to be adopted because that's already done.
or revisions to our existing.
Right. That's done.
Right.
But so it sounds like though, there's two items though that we could follow up on. One, it would be worth checking to see, are there any additional restrictions around design that we could add to our existing 1903 that would add more consistency to our city about how these are applied and built. And I think that would, answering that question as to whether or not, or are we at FCC limitation right now? Or is that something that we could consider as a potential design standard edit? The other one for me is the historic review or historic districts, like getting that answer and whether or not on that prohibited list, if historic districts can go into that list or whether or not it's applicable, that would be good. And it looks like, Ms. Turway, you have possibly an answer.
From my understanding, we couldn't prohibit it from historic districts, but it does meet our definition for major public improvements, which requires historic review board review and consideration. The definition includes any permission by a body to undertake change or physical character, so even if it's just not ours.
But does the historic review board policy, though, have anything on communication towers that would allow them to say, we don't want a tower because we don't like how it looks?
they would have the ability to use design guidelines to make sure it fit the character. So it would be more of like, could it be smaller? Could it be painted? Could it be a different shape or something like that, as opposed to a yes, no?
We will run
Okay.
we'll also run into the challenge of just the shot clock piece. So trying to figure out how do we get through that process faster or take the risk associated with taking longer, right? That'll be a risk.
Because realistically, you're looking at if the Historic Review Board does do something that a provider does not agree with, then you're into an appeal. And I would assume that the 60-day includes all appeals, because technically our final decision is not until the commission makes that decision. In 60 days, I mean, it is going to be almost impossible.
Right. Are there any other items that are outstanding that we would like the city staff to consider?
No, I think you covered them. Although Mr. Lewis said that the packet was voluminous, I appreciated the information. It gave me a better understanding of what we were dealing with. I looked at the plans, and even though I totally didn't get what a small cell was, because it's kind of a term of art, I appreciate the information. So,
Well,
Thank
Dante assembled that.
yes,
so
thank you, Dante.
All right, so I think you got what you needed, Mr. Lewis?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, so the additional item that we added was number 4, and this is a letter of support for a Willamette Falls Trust grant. Ms. Turway.
Thank you. So I want to start by apologizing because I didn't give you anything in writing regarding this. It wasn't in the packet, and it's a last-minute request. So what the city received was a request to support a grant for the National Endowment of the Arts, and the grant would create a space for tribes and indigenous people to work together to create a process for how art, indigenous art, would integrate with the Riverwalk. And so in order for this grant to be submitted, it's a 6-figure grant. They would need the approval or written consent from the highest elected official at the city, which is the mayor. I spoke with the mayor, who said he supported this grant. I can tell you a few more details about it too. And he wanted it to walk onto the commission agenda tonight for your all consideration as well. So this grant doesn't actually fund for a year. Funding won't start till July 1st, 2021. So we're finding ourselves preparing for future talks, even though the timing right now is not ideal. So this grant will again provide a space for tribes and indigenous communities to lead the process themselves for art. And so it's them working together to answer questions at a series of meetings. So there's 2 3-day events where they work together to answer questions like, how might the design of the Riverwalk support the creation and sharing of indigenous arts? How could the Riverwalk incorporate native art to meaningfully and permanently re-indigenize the site? Given the complexity of the intertribal relationships and entwined tribal histories of the site, how might we support the tribes to develop a multi-tribal process for selecting design elements, public art, and ongoing programming for the site? And then what are the opportunities for Native artists and the role of Native arts in realizing the site's potential as a place of healing and reconciliation among Native and non-Native communities? How might Native arts and artists intersect with non-Native arts and artists on site? And so what this grant is, it's the Willamette Falls Trust submitting the grant application, but they're not the ones leading this process. It's creating a space for indigenous people and tribes to work together to identify how indigenous art will integrate with the Riverwalk on site. Again, it doesn't start for a while, but it is due soon, and so the request is for city support of this National Endowments for the Arts grant. The idea is that the grant would also provide a lot of national spotlight for the project as well.
Thank you. So I have 2 questions. One, does the Willamette Falls Trust, do they already have support by the tribes for this grant? And then 2, are the funds actually given to the tribes, or is the funds given to the trust?
So the whole project, From my understanding, the whole project will cost about $500,000. This grant will be for about $100,000, and so the trust, my understanding, is funding the gap between those two. So the funding would go to the trust to administer, but they're not the ones administering the project, just creating a space.
And do they have support letters from the tribes?
I do not know.
Okay, Commissioner Smith.
Then you shouldn't be asking us for support, because clearly the trust is already screwed up with the tribes, and if they're coming to us asking for money for a process that involved the tribes, and we don't know if we have their support, that is ridiculous.
Perfect.
They may, I just don't, I'm personally unaware. You could offer your support provided you have other support from pick the number of tribes.
No, I think it's more that we need to hear from Willamette Falls Trust as to whether or not they have support from the tribes, or hear from the tribes themselves that they support this before I personally would be willing to give my support. Commissioner O'Donnell?
I certainly echo both your statement and Commissioner Smith's statement. There's already been one major misstep. Let's not duplicate it again. Let's talk to our partners and see what their feelings are. Thanks.
Okay, and then just to, again, apologies. This is due soon, which is the end of the week. And so if the city doesn't support it, they will not submit for the grant. And so I can work to see if we have that support from the tribes. If we do, could we communicate it to the commission over email?
Yes, I think you can. It sounds like ultimately this is the mayor's decision and he wanted to get input from us. So I assume he will watch this and you can provide to him the input that this commission is providing, that at this point in time, we don't support it. Commissioner McGriff?
No, I support them applying for the grant.
Okay, so,
okay. So I hear the direction that the commission is concerned that there's not support by the tribes, who are ultimately needed to make this success anyway, since they're participating in it. So we'll go back and see what we can get there, and then I'll follow up with an email. Thank you for your consideration.
Anytime you can apply for money and those amounts, that the opportunity should be made available.
I agree, but making steps forward without bringing in the partners and getting them on board, or at least asking them if they want to participate, is another show of disrespect and kind of a misstep in showing that you want to include them up front. And as a collaborative partner, it goes out in front of them and just makes an assumption about their participation. And so that's just where I'm at.
I'm just making the assumption, let's just say I'm going to act in good faith that they wouldn't do this without getting support, but you are asking for verification, and I'm okay with that.
They already have a track record, and our staff should know about that. They come for us and ask for support without getting the support of all the partners involved in the grant. That doesn't make any sense to me.
So to be clear, the mayor asked for this item to be brought to us to provide feedback to staff on whether or not, where the city commission was at, on whether or not we would provide a letter of support.
That is correct.
So I don't want to shoot the messenger.
Right.
Yeah.
I guess I would say that if the mayor wants to write a letter of support, that's up to him, but that's not coming from the commission.
Commissioner Smith, when you say partners, do you mean the main public partners, or are you talking about the partners of the tribes?
I meant that in general, meaning that if the grant is about the indigenous people, then they need to have a conversation about being part of this grant.
Okay.
That's for.
Okay, I wanted to be clear, because the word partners means a lot of different things, and I refer to the jurisdictions as those are the partners, project partners.
That's true, with a capital P.
I'm sure they have. I'm happy to report to you once I find out.
Yes,
for sure.
I think you have direction. City manager's report, Mr. Conkle.
I don't have any updates for tonight.
Okay, commission committee reports. Instead of reading all of these off, I think a lot of them are maybe not happening, so I'll just go around to each commissioner. Commissioner McGriff.
Yes, the Downtown Association has been meeting on a regular basis. They are very excited about the pending approvals of some of the parklets. I understand there's some applications in and they are pending, and hopefully they will come out the other side. I was in Selwood today and saw another interesting concept, but I wasn't able to get a picture of it, so I'll have to just describe it to Laura at some point and tell her what it looked like. My other committee is the Willamette Falls Heritage and Landings. They have also continued to meet through all of this. We have a couple of new members, which is really great, and that will round it out. They're creating a diversity, equity, and inclusion committee for the group to make sure that they are on the straight and narrow and the P's and Q's with all of that, since we do also involve the tribes. The group is continuing to move forward with the old City Hall, although there was some kerfuffle over the weekend with regard to the city of West Lynn, which I do not want to go into, but it is still moving forward, albeit slowly. And I guess the other thing I could report on wasn't an official committee, but I was asked to be on the review committee for the new city manager for the city of West Lynn, and they have definitely appointed someone. He's coming from, yes, actually Michigan, a small town about the size of West Lynn. His last name is Gallegos. And I'm really encouraged by the selection. The Metro Committee that I'm on, representing citizenry of Oregon City, has only done a meet and greet, and we talked about things like meeting management, and the public interest item was, what is your favorite dessert? So I reported it's Marion Berry Pie. So we have another meeting coming up on the 13th, and I will report back to the city manager and to Mr. Graham on the results of that. I've not seen the agenda as of yet.
Okay, Commissioner Smith.
No reports other than South Fork. Want to congratulate Wyatt Parno. We discussed his future contract and want to wish him luck in his new job coming in the future. So that's, oh, I see Wyatt's thumb just went up.
Can we be happy and sad about that all at the same time?
Exactly, we're definitely.
I'm crying on the inside.
Frank, is there anything else from South Fork? We're working on our a specific project, but I think that's.
We're working on projects that we want to have ready if federal funding becomes available in an attempt to revitalize this economy.
Okay, anything else? Okay, Commissioner O'Donnell?
Well, I have no further reports on committees. It's been fairly stagnant. I want these parklets to do this city honor and be attractive. And I'm a little concerned, and I just say, please do a good job on them. I got a nasty surprise when I saw containerized housing behind Milner Veterinary, which I had no idea was included in affordable housing. So do a good job, people, and make us proud and do your city proud. And that's all I've got to say.
Yes, I was wondering that too. Ms. Turway, can you, I've heard about those shipping containers that are being used, and I want to make sure we're communicating correctly. Are they allowed? My understanding is they were not part of our affordable housing code changes that we did, so.
That is correct. We've always allowed shipping containers as housing as long as they met our design standards. We just never had them.
Okay. All right, so thanks for clarifying. Do you have anything else, Commissioner O'Donnell?
No, Ms. Rachel Al Smith, Commissioner Smith, I don't.
Thank you. All right, so I did not attend. I'm the alternate for the C4 Clackamas County Coordinating Committee. I did not attend that because I chose to listen to Chief Band give his presentation to Unite Oregon City. We talked about that earlier. He gave that on Thursday. I think it was well received, lots of really great questions. And I was really glad I got to listen in. And the Metro Policy Advisory Committee will not meet again until September. So I believe that is it.
Move we adjourn.
All right, no other communications. This meeting's adjourned.
Thank you.
Thanks.